Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning. In the year 2008, the critic Gitanjali Singh Chanda, she published a book titled Indian Women in the House of Fiction. So today, before we start discussing Anita Desai's novel Cry the Peacock, I wanted to introduce to some of the concepts that she talks about in her seminal work Indian Women in the House of Fiction. While we were introducing the genre and the critical tradition which formulated this genre, this discipline, Indian fiction and English, we spoke about how at a certain historical period, the entire oeuvre of work which falls under the label Indian fiction, Indian writing in English, they were brought together, and this was began to be offered as a course by Srinivasa Iyengar. We began to see how Meenakshi Mukherjee makes this intervention by talking particularly about the genre of fiction, and she began to alert us to the need to look at the genre specifically in the Indian historical context. And it was only much later, from the 1990s onwards, we began to pay very definite, very focused attention on women who are writing in this house of Indian English fiction. So Gitanjali Singh Chanda's work is positioned at a certain historical period when women's writings are gaining a certain attention, and there is a sensibility that beyond ensuring mere visibility, there should also be sufficient critical attention, there should also be sufficient problematization of women's writing, especially in the context of the newfound visibility in the post-1980s, in the post-Rushdie period. I find Gitanjali Singh Chanda's introduction to this work particularly useful. It is located historically. She talks about how her own training had made her insufficiently attentive to certain kinds of texts, and I quote from the introduction that she wrote in 2008. It was a restless April hot Delhi day, and I was almost 19. I read Anita Desai's Cry the Peacock. The shock of recognition made me realize what I had missed in my study of canonical English literature. It was not just the presentation of an Indian context or names and people who looked and spoke like me, but the texture of the emotionally nuanced mindscapes of Desai's women characters that resonated and called me to myself. My heartfelt thanks to those who continued to write even when Indian women's writing in English was often viewed as mimicry. She speaks about the need to reinvent the canon, to need to reinvent the formulations, the lenses through which Indian women's writing was seen until that point of time. If we try to situate women in the nation, we just forget about how it is positioned within Indian writing in English or Indian fiction in English. If we try to situate women and the aspects of gender in the context of the nation, we may have to begin really way back from the 19th century onwards with the colonial interventions. We know about the kind of impetus that English education received after Macaulay's Minutes in 1835, and the English education, the different modes of modernities, those were all seen as vehicles for social reform and modernization. And we have also seen how the nationalist reformers also found this idea extremely conducive, that English education can in multiple ways enhance the kind of modernity, the kind of initiation into modernity that India was encountering then. And the status of the women, it was always a central concern for India's modernity. When we talk about gender, when we talk about the issues related to women, it's difficult not to speak also about the various interventions initiated by the nationalist reformers and also the colonial administrators, We know about the extensive discourse in the context of the movements against sati, or the advocacy for widow remarriage, about the need for female literacy, about the need to fight female infanticide. So the women question was always at the center of India's encounter with modernity. English education, most of the nationalist reformers and the colonial administrators believed, would try and take a mid path as far as a women's question is concerned. For that, in that sense, we find that women were introduced to a number of morally enabling texts of English culture, which they thought would be useful in order to retain certain traditional aspects which were part of the Indian culture, and also initiate them into modernity, initiate them into English education as far as the need of the hour was concerned. So there was this desire within the nationalist men, and as well as the modern educated men of those period, to help women become companionate wives. They didn't want the women to break out entirely of the traditional strongholds. They did not want the women to challenge all kinds of traditional notions. They wanted patriarchy to exist in a certain form, but at the same time they wanted to enable the women to become companionate wives. And in a larger sense, if we extend this argument, the women were needed to support the formation of a modern nation. But it also had to be ensured that women will continue to be bearers of tradition. Women will continue to ensure that tradition is not entirely destroyed with this newfound enabling modes of modernity. Partha Chatterjee very centrally addresses this question in his 1989 essay, The Nationalist Resolution of the Women's Question. In a couple of sessions earlier also, we did refer to this essay. The English education and the newfound access to various vehicles of modernity, this was found to be a double-edged sword as well. Kumkum Sanghari and White, they have done some interesting work on this aspect at the intersection of tradition and modernity, especially with respect to women. They have noted, I read from their work, it is in this historical intersection that women began to constitute themselves in journals, autobiographies, poems, narratives and diaries, and to which we owe the formation of an Anglo-Indian literature. Here Kumkum Sanghari and White are talking about an early phase from the late 19th century and early 20th century onwards. This is also a phase when English education is being made available to all men and women, especially from a certain mostly from a certain class. We also get to know that these women who are being educated to become companionate wives, being taught to maintain a certain kind of a balance between tradition and modernity, they are also being encouraged to write. And this becomes a double-edged sword. Modernization, the use of English language, not only enables them to become good individuals and good wives and educated citizens of the modern nation, but it also encourages them to express themselves. This was perhaps something that the nation was not yet ready to deal with. That's a different question altogether that we shall not be going into the details of right away. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that English education and modernity, which were predominantly colonial tools, which were predominantly the tools of the nationalist establishments, we find that those made available to women an unconventional set of tools, and they used these tools to refashion themselves. In one of the earlier sessions, when we had briefly taken a look at one of the earliest Malayalam novels, Indulekha, we did see how the central protagonist, Indulekha, is being enabled to refashion herself in certain ways. And think about a woman who is not only now introduced to English education, but she also has a power to express herself. So this is what education and modernity together began to do to women's writing in the early 20th century. And this has been termed as a twofold adventure by Meenakshi Mukherjee. She talks about how these women were also forced to reconcile between two sets of values. The one set of value was predominantly Western, This was obtained by reading an alien literature written in English, produced from England, and the other was their own experience, the experience that was made available to them from their own immediate context, from their own engagements with family, with society, and with the different contexts of the nation. This did deal, at least some of them, to a lot of dilemma. They had to choose between this alien culture which was enabling them and the immediate context, immediate life context, which were closer to their heart, but at the same time were delimiting and were containing them in multiple ways. If you take one of the earliest examples, Atia Hussein's partition novel, Sunlight on a Broken Column, it speaks about the chasm between English education and an Indian lifestyle, and there we find these articulations of the anxieties of belonging, of identity, of the need to associate oneself with a certain community. The act of writing historically, if we overview it, particularly when it comes to women, it has always been seen as a subversive activity. We do find the kind of containment with which was at work whenever it came to addressing the issues related to the act of writing by women. And women across borders, across the irrespective of the differences in terms of region, language, community, class, caste, everything. Women across a broad spectrum of all of these material things, they have realized that ultimate transgression can render them homeless. And this is evident not just in certain kinds of cultures and certain kinds of languages. We do find these sort of challenging articulations coming out from women writers, even at the risk of endangering themselves in various ways. We find this in the English tradition. If you take a look at it, the writings of Virginia Woolf, and how she even questions the absence of space when it comes to the ways in which a woman writer operates. So now I'm trying to draw your attention to the idea of home and how the act of writing, which is being carried out from this home space, as far as the early 20th century is concerned, this home space is the nation, the yet to be nation, and the external influences are the colonial influences. When we move a little ahead in time, during the post-independence period, that's the period when this novel that we are about to discuss today, Anita Desai's Cry the Peacock, is written. During that time, women are still being made to negotiate between these different spaces made available to them. They are still not too sure of how much they can express themselves, how much they are allowed to transgress, allowed to, I use it within quotes. They are still not sure how much of the modernity can be used to enable them, and not too sure how much traditional they are expected to become in order to not endanger the kinds of facilities which are being made available to them. Yeah. So, home in that sense, if we go back to Partha Chatterjee's essay again, which is a useful entry point whenever we talk about the issues of nation and how women are situated in that, he illustrates this idea to show us the role played by the idea of home within the nationalist space. The home in its essence must remain unaffected by the profane activities of the material world, and woman is its representation. Partha Chatterjee is not talking about the literary writing. He is not talking about Indian writing in English. He is not talking about the writing of fiction by women. But this becomes very useful. This is useful for us to understand how even within Indian fiction in English, even within this space of literary writing, there is a way in which women are being invested with the responsibility of protecting home as the inner space. And this space needs to be unsullied by contact with outside. It's this inside-outside dichotomy that we find being played out in most of the works written by women writers. This may operate at various levels. When we look at a novel like Heat and Dust, we know that the outside-inside dichotomy is played out in a totally different way altogether. Here, there we find a woman who is not entirely Indian, but who's acquired a certain lived experience in India, who comes into contact with certain Indian men with whom she is negotiating certain relationships which are also sexual in nature. Yeah. But when it comes to a writer like Anita Desai and her novel Cry the Peacock, we find a different kind of inside-outside at work. We find citizens of the same country, we find men and women who belong to the same country, the same nation, being forced to negotiate the amount of space that they can occupy within the home. And in that context, it's also useful to remember that right from the beginning, men's adoption of Western norms, men's uncritical adoption of modernity, that was always seen as a practical necessity. There were no moral links to it. It was not seen as an act of loyalty or as an act of defiance. Nevertheless, we may also recall some of the anxieties that writers like Raja Rao had in writing in an alien language, but nevertheless, when they justify the need to write in English, and when they produce their first work and a body of writing in the alien language, in the foreign language, they are not being judged for that. On the contrary, their nationalist loyalties, the practical necessity of this, all of those are strengthened, they are further strengthened. But as far as a woman is concerned, a woman's westernization has always been seen as a betrayal, which is why we have a number of writings from the 19th century onwards giving moral codes to women, how to behave in this society so that your traditional values are not compromised beyond a certain extent. Yeah. So, this dichotomy is extremely interesting. Yeah, if I could draw your attention to the novel that we discussed in the previous class, A Strange Case of Billy Bishwas by Arun Joshi, we find that the man is allowed to do a number of things because he is disillusioned with modernity, because he finds it extremely important to identify and be in terms with his own self, and the transgressions, the sexual transgressions, the moral choices that he makes, the betrayal, if one could call it that the family faces, those are not seen as moral or amoral choices. On the other hand, those are seen as the ways in which the man is allowed to respond to his self, the calling of his self. He is allowed to run away from home. But one needs to wait and see whether those kinds of choices are being made available to the woman who is the protagonist in this novel Cry the Peacock. We find that she is forced to act, she is forced to behave only in response to certain confinements of home, certain expectations, and her liberation cannot be at the expense of many other things which surround her. The stakes are placed quite differently as far as the woman is concerned. Those are certain things that we shall come back to we shall try to come back to at a later point. I would like to present this case to you that within the space of Indian fiction, the women's spaces are created from within a dominant patriarchal space. And this is an argument which some of the feminist critics have also put forward, and they also argue that this has been framed by certain kind of persistence. And these women only spaces, this is again in the context of screening of the film Fire, which had caused a lot of controversy on account of his homosexual contents. And Gomati and Fernandez, who are social activists and feminist activists who were responding to the issues related to the film Fire, they stated that the women only spaces are allowed only if women in it are seen as sexually active within them. So, there is a provision for allowing women only spaces. There is a provision for enabling women's spaces, but those spaces and the articulations which come out of those spaces should not necessarily challenge or subvert any of the existing notions. This seems to be the deal. And unfortunately, to a very large extent, we find that the women's space which is generated from Indian fiction in English, from the space of Indian fiction in English, that also operates within this dominant patriarchal space. This is not to say that there's a formula for this kind of an operation. We do find some of the novels, say for example Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, challenging the gender roles in significant ways. There are women moving out of the patriarchal space and carving out a niche space for themselves, though there's a lot at stake. That's a different question altogether again. Here I also take this liberty to very quickly do a comparison between Chhabwala, whose work we saw a little earlier, and Desai's work, which we are just about to see. In the first essay that we discussed, the introduction to Vintage Book of Indian Writing, co-edited by Rushdie and Elizabeth West. He argues that literature has little or nothing to do with the writer's home address. Is this the case? We need to ask how the critical tradition configures and reconfigures notions of Indianness, woman and home. If you take two writers, Chhabwala and Desai, who are from totally different backgrounds, whose claims to Indianness are placed in two different ways, whose lived experiences are evaluated and are framed through various other social political mediations, you need to ask whether their home address play a role or whether their home address plays a role or not in the way their works are received. One also needs to ask whether this works differently when it comes to male writers and female writers. That's again another question that we need to address. And what we can perhaps notice as a broad trend is that home as a gendered space affects men and women quite differently. This is very evident in the way we look at least the last couple of novels that we had discussed, Strange Case of Billy Bishwa's Heat and Dust, and today the novel when we see Cry the Peacock, it will be quite evident that home as a gendered space, I repeat, it affects men and women differently. The articulations are different, the modes of enabling are different, the ways in which the women characters are allowed to respond, the male characters are allowed to respond, those are radically different from one another. And there are of course a lot of concerns in addition to this we may need to gloss over at this point of time, but nevertheless these are certain useful questions to ask if you need to come up with newer frameworks to deal with texts which do not neatly fit into the available frameworks. It would be rather lame to say that all women's writing is always about resistance. It would be a very lame claim to make, and it would be rather more nuanced, more useful and more nuanced if we say that women have been participants in the construction and transmission of these ideologies as they have also been shaped by them. So it is not as if many of these articulations of subservience or of dominance, they are done through certain active set of ideologies with very conscious frame of mind. They could be inadvertent as well, but nevertheless it needs to be admitted that women writers, women characters and women in general have also been participants in this process of constructing certain labels or constructing certain identities, because they too have been shaped by that. Whether we are looking at a work like Cry the Peacock or Heat and Dust or any of the other novels written by women such as Kamala Markandeya, Shashi Deshpande, or at a later point even radically different work such as Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, we begin to notice certain patterns. And those patterns need not necessarily suggest a chronological development or progression. It is again not to say that we can trace the historical evolution of women's movement or the historical the change in the articulation of the women's question if we look at Indian women's writing. Certain patterns may be evident, they may overlap each other, they may also be totally and radically different from each other. I would like to read to you from one of the concluding remarks made in Chanda's book. A significant feature of Indo-English women's novels is the desire to project the past, or at least some elements of it, into the future. They propose alteration rather than a radical transformation of homes that they have known. The novels recommend reviewing and changing those aspects of traditional family life that silence women but acknowledge the overall importance of both family and tradition. We find some kind of a balancing act at work over here. We do not find the women writers entirely rejecting the ideas of home, rejecting the ideas of tradition, rejecting the ideas of patriarchy. We find them trying to renegotiate with all of these aspects, with all of these institutions and establishments. We trying to propose alterations. Here I also digress a bit and draw your attention to a novel that we will be doing at a later point, The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. One of the critics, Ajay Shekhar, has pointed out that Roy has been very successful in subverting the ideas of gender, subverting the ideology of patriarchy. But the same tool has not been used very successful when it comes to caste. There's a certain kind of containment, there's a certain kind of politics of containment which continues to be at work. That's something that we need to take a look at a later point. But what I'm trying to drive home is the idea that beyond a certain point, it seems as if the women writers have not been able to entirely reject certain ideologies and certain conventions which had been historically, culturally and socially delimiting the articulations of women from the 19th century onwards. And also it needs to be admitted that whenever we talk about the space of Indian fiction in English, the house of Indian fiction in English, it's mostly a male preserve. You look at the successful, highly successful commercial writers, even if you look at the award-winning writers, you look at the set of writers who have been continually getting critical attention, you look at the syllabi of Indian writing in English or Indian fiction in English, we find that it is entirely a male preserve. There is a certain space which would be perhaps even safe to say that within the house of fiction, perhaps there is a room allotted to women who are writing, a room allotted to women. Within that room, within that space of containment, they are allowed to transgress, they are allowed to question, they are allowed to radically alter the paradigms of many of the things which are being taught and taught to them, and the thought which has been received by them. But beyond that point, it always needs to be reminded to them, and it always needs to be acknowledged by the critical tradition that their space is only a room inside this huge house of Indian fiction in English, this huge house of fiction within India. I would rather agree with Gitanjali Singh Chanda's observation towards the end of her work that houses of fiction alter and extend the realistic models they invoke, suggesting a strategy of change from within. One wouldn't really know how successful this strategy is going to be, but nevertheless it is very important to acknowledge that certain kinds of paradigmatic shifts are at work when it comes to women writing in English, and also one needs to be attentive to the modes of altercations that these women writers are bringing forth, even when that is not within the established frameworks of critical writings and critical understanding. I now also invite one of our students, Ashwati, to share with us some of the insights that she gained from her reading of the novel Cry the Peacock.
It's me, Ashwati Venugopal, going to present on the novel Cry the Peacock, written by Anita Desai. Have any of you read any other novels of Anita Desai, like very vague familiarity with the author? Yeah, so first of all, we'll move on to the very short biography of the author, just in a very few details, just enough to understand the context of the novel in discussion. Yeah, so she was born in Mussoorie. I think today it's Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand area, and she had a bicultural heritage because her father was a Bengali and her mom was from Germany. So she stayed in India till she had education in the Delhi, and only after marriage that she went and settled in US. So she had this access to English, Bengali, German, so the access to multiple languages. And she spoke English. She grew up as a person who spoke English mostly at home, like with parents and all. So it was basically English was home. She wasn't that alien to English, so she didn't choose to write in English. She was educated, she spoke in English, so very much close to English in that way. She was shortlisted thrice for the Booker Prize, and she had won Sahitya Akademi Award in 1978 for her work. We'll look into a few of her works. And besides novels, she has written a few children's fiction, short stories, and these are very few of the popular novels. So Fire on the Mountain is the one that she won the Sahitya Akademi Award for. In Custody is also very critically discussed novel, and Artist of Disappearance is the very recent one. Fasting, Feasting, all of them you can make out from the cover pages itself that they're mostly speaking about female protagonists, mostly engaging with women, and yeah. So now let's move on to the novel in detail. It was her first novel, which was published in 1963, and she is one of the prominent among this line of Kamla Markandeya, Chabwala that we discussed in class, of contemporary Indian English women's fiction. There's a whole genre like that. And she is also known as belonging to the second generation of Indian English novelists. So this is a very vague classification. I think we have already discussed in one of our materials about Indian fiction divided into three phases, and first generation belonging to Mulk Raj Anand, and then R.K. Narayan in 20s and 30s. And then there are a few novelists, very prominent 50s and 60s, and then very modern ones that comes post 1980s with Rushdie and Roy. So she is unique among all the women, Indian English women's fiction writers for a few reasons. I will move on to it. So before moving on to why this novel is significant, or why this novel is, how can we place it in this long trajectory of Indian English women's fiction, or generally Indian English fiction as such, is that it ushered in a new genre called psychological novel or psychological realism. So it's something very unique, and Indian fiction was just encountering it for the first time among other women novels, women-based novels. So I'll just quickly go through, since all of you might have read the summary, I'll just very quickly go through the plot just enough to support my presentation. So basically there are Maya and Gautama, two characters, husband and wife. Their temperaments are like on poles, like at either side of the pole. Maya is a very sensitive, emotional, dreamy, so the probable adjectives that you can give to the character. And Gautama is this very practical, detached, intellectual guy. And this woman is like she takes happiness from very, 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 very small things in life. For example, she takes happiness from, say, flowers in her garden, from birds around her, from animals that she is, from her pets. So that's how temperamentally different they are. So you can imagine this Gautama as this very, so-called intellectual husband who sits and discusses over intellectual matters, worldly things. Well, Maya has a very small but beautiful world. So the entire novel has three parts. First two parts is you are actually dwelling inside Maya's mind. Like it's all first person narration and Maya's explaining her problems, like starting with why she is feeling alienated in her own house, why she is so temperament different from her husband Gautama, why she is not able to cope with Gautama's character and all of, and then I think it's like 3/4 of the novel, I mean more than 90% of the novel is part 1 and part 2 explaining entire Maya the character. You do actually dwell inside her brain, and then part 3 just quickly switches off to third person narration, in which so this climax, I think that I know it's again a spoiler, but she goes insane after all this neurotic development of hers, and she is actually like like medically she is insane. And that third part is the only one that you get a third person narration of their family life. So why this is called a psychological novel is because this is probably for the first time that Indian English fiction look into inner consciousness of human being, inner self. It's entirely about Maya's mind, Maya's thoughts, Maya's whatever she thinks about. You can actually equate it to the stream of consciousness technique, that whatever comes to her mind is entirely, it's a very direct or clear-cut expression of what, it's actually in the form of dialogues itself, what she thinks. You come to know about the character of Gautama only through Maya's eyes for the first 2 parts, like only through Maya's eyes. And how much you know about the character of Gautama is only through, it's very limited compared to what you know about the character of Maya. So that is why you feel you are like an intimate witness to all of it, or to put it better, you are actually dwelling inside her brain. Psychological realism, she said it was not a deliberate attempt of hers to do it. In fact, she was unique because she deliberately chose not to write about social themes, which other novelists of that time, I think Chabwala we discussed, she discussed about social themes, East-West encounter, politics to some extent, even other Indian English writers or women Indian English writers. She would deliberately put it, she has actually said it, my novels are no reflection of Indian society. You don't expect me to write about society, social themes, pressures and all of that, politics, character, nothing of those times or society of those times. They are part of my private effort to seize upon the raw material of life, its shapelessness, its meaninglessness. So she actually says, what she actually expects from this literature, according to her, the purpose of literature is not to, express her ideas or opinions about social themes or social, economical, political ideologies or something. No, it's not the way that she's going to shape it. She wants to look into, actually thrive into, human beings, inner self of human beings. She actually prefers the inner reality to the outer, insight to sight, that's what she says. And private world is what she focuses on. And so in this case, it's Maya's private world, it's her troubled sensibilities, it's her troubled feminine sensibilities that is explained throughout the novel. So hope you guys got a very vague idea of what the novel is talking about, what is its significance in the trajectory, what was Anita Desai trying to do through the novel. Now we'll move into the themes. So themes, so there is very few critical material, so because all in the previous presentations we have had like very popular critics, Meenakshi Mukherjee and other very popular critics talking about novels, but even she herself hasn't talked much about this novel. So there are very few critical material if you go back and check by popular critics as such. So whatever you find are only a few things which are generally talking about Aruna Desai's female protagonist. Maya is projected as Desai is exemplary of feminine consciousness. How? So she is one of the prominent interpretations say she is a representative of postmodern feminism. I'm sure you will feel it's a very heavy loaded term, but I'll just explain it in this particular context. So as already explained, in a postmodern world, you focus on individual. There is a freedom, power, sense of existence, identity for an individual. And women, because they have been historically marginalized in the sense, especially in Indian societies where there is some form of expectations about how she should be, how a wife or a woman in the house should be, and what she has been stereotypically limited to home, domesticity. So in this context, it's important because in this novel, women begin to see the universe with their own eyes, not through male gaze. Like, it's no way influenced by how the male world wants the women to look at the world, and societal norms that expect them to have. So for example, they should preserve family culture. The entire burden of responsibility of preserving family should be on women. So all these stereotypes associated with it is an entire, the Maya character is an entire antithesis to all these stereotypes. In fact, postmodernism strives to get some acceptance from the audience about fracture. It's actually fine to have fractured identity. No identity is so linear, so uniform that you always remain the same. It's actually very fine to have a fractured identity, and that's exactly how what Desai tries to portray through the novel. She has an extremely fractured identity. She is partly, maybe in the modern sense, I don't know whether you can call it irrational or emotional. I mean, it's not the matter of judging the character of Maya. It's all about she just doesn't give up to what other world, which is dominated by so-called patriarchy, expects from her. Then there is a universal theme of alienation, which is more prominent in the case of women subjects. So Anita Desai's novels, almost all of them focus on solitary individual beings. So here in this particular novel, there is marital discord due to the difference in their temperament, and in fact there is a part where you have heard this Indian proverb called, not proverb, it's actually from the Pita Rakshadi Kaumare Putro Rakshadi Vardhake. Exactly, there's it's a parallel to it. So there is a dialogue for Maya, father, brother, husband, who is my savior? I'm in need of one, I'm dying and I'm in love with living. I'm in love and I'm dying. So many parallels from Indian culture, and marital discord is so explained in so clear-cut detail that there is a dialogue from when she starts. This is the initial part of the novel. So she says, giving me an opal ring to wear on my finger, he did not notice the translucent skin beneath, the blue flashing veins that ran under and out of the bridge of gold, and jolted me into smiling with pleasure each time I saw it. So this is a very clear-cut that's literally how you dwell in somebody's mind. You know exactly what Maya is feeling about her relationship. She's all sorts of expectations from her husband. Her relationship with her husband is all denied, and to the point that there is very serious communication gap between the husband and wife, and that turn she becomes rebellious in some sort. But she can't express her rebelliousness even. That's explained. So she has a brother called Arjuna. He left home after fighting with their parents around the age of 22 or something. She has this very great awe for, feeling for her brother who actually had the courage to leave and show how rebellious he is. And it's all about this women caught in social, economic, cultural, political crisis of all sorts, and to the point that ultimately she ends up losing her sanity, losing her mental poise. And finally there is bondage to traditional roles. Have been already discussed what do you expect from domestic lives of women. And also ultimately there is discussion about when you actually dwell deep into it, she is economically dependent on her husband. Psychologically also she is really brilliant. Like to the whole part of the novel, she has never given up. She is entirely expecting, so persistent in expecting what she feels from what she expects from her husband, the love, the caring, the need to be heard, until to the point that she actually makes herself that beautiful moment. Till that point, that beautiful not beautiful exactly, that striking moment when she actually twists her thoughts, saying, so till then it was either of them who was going to die after 4 years of her marriage. In the 4th year, she's just so disturbed with that thought. She just imagine that state of mind of hers when she just thinks, oh, it can't be me. I love life. Like, why should I die? Gautama is so detached. Like, it doesn't matter if if he dies or not. So, to the point, so till that point, exactly what Maya is going through till the moment she reaches that particular thought. So this novel is a very good reflection of women's predicament as such, because after marriage you get uprooted from the family, you actually start belonging to the in-laws and very much uprooted from your own family. You don't have any identity attached to your family before you, to the point you change your second name with your husband's name, and you belong to the in-laws, and after that there is some form of restriction on their freedom, their sense of freedom, especially in this case because Maya is childless, so she faces some sort of loss of identity, because when she goes to meet her peers, when she goes to meet the friends of her husband, there is some sort of discrimination in that sort. She is always seen with this eye, okay, childless wife. So she is actually isolated in terms of that. And beyond material comfort, she needs to be heard. All this needs, nobody else in the novel realizes except the audience, the reader realizes it so much from what Maya says. And for example, there are other alternative interpretations of women of those times. For example, very interesting. Gautama's sister and mother is introduced in some parts. So Gautama's sister, her name is Nila. So they present this positive symbols of strength and positivity, unlike hers, who always laments her predicament. The novel says his ability to fight all the odds that come into her life, and she actually says, after 10 years with that rabbit I married, I've learned to do everything myself. And then there is Leela and Pom. Leela is Maya's friend. She's another alternate women character. She is portrayed as a woman nursing her dying husband, and she kind of accepts her fate. Like, that's what Indian women are supposed to do apparently at that time. Continues to live that way. And there is Maya's childhood friend Pom. She's a rebellious character, but she tried to rebel against her mother-in-law's arrogance initially, but ultimately she succumbed to her dominance, that's what the novel says. So the alternate images of women, you can very well compare them in contrast to Maya's character. And then this beautiful theme of home, especially in Indian context. So home, you have this expression being at home because, home is shelter, some sense of protection, some sort of private space in which you can freely express your identity without any restriction. That's what you basically expect from a home, So wherever you can express your identity, your feelings freely, that's where you feel at home. This is an entire contradiction. This novel is an entire contradiction to how women conceive, for Indian women, how home, even the concept of home was, dictated to them by the society. Their social identity was linked to home, how they preserved their family, how they was in their family, they as a secondary to the husband, all of them, especially during those times, 1960s and 50s, when Anita Desai is writing the novel. It's very important. Even though within their family and society and all of that, she's totally through social pressures, all these pressures in the sense, expectations, burdens. And so their sense of, she finds it really hard to accept that confinement, and she's psychologically, socially dislocated even inside a home where you actually are supposed to feel located very, very comfortably, and in a sense of individuality. Everything is so threatened inside the home because in-laws, her husband, nobody tries to understand her. Again, it's not part of judging her, you know, you just accept her as she is. And I just talked about the stereotypes in Indian legends and cultures, just the Putro Rakshadi, that part where there's a lot of similar stereotypes too. And there are, I think, metaphors like, especially with the title, this is really important. So the title, Cry the Peacock, we were wondering what is the significance of the title with the story. So she mentions in some part, the peacocks, it's a very interesting story. The peacocks apparently in their mating process, they actually fight with each other to the point, either of them actually gets injured, gets defeated, to the point that they actually die. So this is what the concept of dying in love. So that's exactly, if we put it on to Maya's life, you know, she is fighting for love till the end, and ultimately to the point, she kills her husband. The title itself is a metaphor. Though we smile it off as such today, when you actually look through the novel, at some moments you actually might feel justified at certain points. So not justified in the sense, you tend to understand what Maya is going through. She is psychic in some sense. We need to accept that. She reacts too much. She actually lives every moment, but every moment she lives through her senses. That's it. That's what makes her different. So this is almost about the main themes or portrayal of Indian women in the novel. Moving on to how Anita Desai has brought about some Indianness, because in the novel is through no other description of the context of the place where they're living other than some place they say they went. So she is going for shopping with her in-laws, which is in Delhi. That's only mention of the place. Otherwise, the novel is such a compelling narrative, you don't even feel the need to know the background, place, temporal setting or the spatial setting. It's the only place where you mention that it's India where it's happening. And there is weather, flora, fauna, religious and mythical figures, like there's a mention of Shiva and the Tandava, dance of death, and really folk elements. The novel is entirely surrounded at this astrologer's prophecy, you know, the prediction, all of them is very much centered in Indian culture. Prediction, you know, that's a whole description of the astrologer. He is a albino, and you know, it's actually, you go through some psycho thriller movie, that's how you feel when you read the novel. And there's a lot of images coming through, and very, very disjuncted images, and then a random progression of images. Exactly how you feel when you read the novel. And then just to show that India, she is a, you know, supposedly Indian woman, there she sometimes says. So she went with her husband to some party in which talks about cabera goers, like people who go and attend cabera dances and all that. And she's like, no, she's not really influenced by it, but she actually condemns it, you know, what supposedly the stereotyping of Indian women as such. And her use of Indian English is very important in the novel, especially in our course, Indian fiction in English. We need to understand that it was a literary language because she acquired it through her schooling. Like she, first of all, at an age of 7 or 9, she started writing her first stories, her first novel. She started off because she was educated in that language. It's nothing different about it. Missionary school education, Delhi college education, she actually says it's her literary language that she is using. And her English is, you can't say it's uniquely Indian, it's uniquely her own English, you know. There are a lot of metaphors like just Shiva and the myth from all these folk tales, all of those examples. And it's very much grounded in Indian culture, Indian myths and tales. And ultimately all these novels, most of her initial novels are entirely psychological novels, going into mostly women protagonists, individuals, you know, female self, alienation, all these universal themes. But much later, like towards her later part of her literary career, she is writing more of, you know, social reality. She is actually the artist of disappearance of novel that I just showed. Very recent novel. She actually realized she should be, you know, in venturing sometime into not just limited to individual things, and she has some relevant topics to discuss or to write in her novels about social themes. And towards her later part, her actress. So this is an entire journey of her life, you know, just how the themes focus, how a writer's interest changes over time due to context or due to the response to her novels and all of that. So really sorry I couldn't bring out any, you know, very critical perspectives because it actually lack. And even just before the class, in the discussion I had with ma'am, she was saying she never encountered she herself was not talking much about the novel in her this particular novel. And she talks about many of her other novels, but not this novel. So I'm just still pondering over what could have been the reasons why this would not happen. I'm still pondering over it. My presentation might be limited in that sense, because unlike compared to other novels, couldn't get like a critical material on it. But these are the major themes which are very much grounded in India, Indian context, Indian women. And this inauguration of this genre called psychological realism is what made Anita Desai, immortal in the trajectory. That's pretty much of it. I hope you got a not general idea, like a very good idea. I hope you're inspired to go back and read the novel. That's a basic expectation. Yeah, that's it.
A couple of other things that I would like to draw your attention to in terms of this novel, Cry the Peacock. Firstly, we need to notice the mode of publication of this work, Cry the Peacock, the novel. It was initially published by Orient Paperbacks, and this was the publisher with whom most of the Indian writers was engaging with in their earlier period, but we do find that in the post-1980s, they all moved towards global publishers. There's more visibility to their work. It also ensures, better kind of saleability and marketability as well. But we find Anita Desai sticking to Orient Paperbacks for a long time, especially in the early stages of her career. And Cry the Peacock is one of her earliest novels, and certain things which would be useful from the certain details which we need to pay attention from the novel, I would like to bring to your attention. Certain discussions related to this novel do remind us of the play Doll's House by Ibsen. We find the character of Maya undergoing a radical change from the beginning towards the end of the novel, and there's a certain parallel that we can see in the change that the character in Doll's House, Nora, undergoes from the beginning towards the end. Even in this novel, in the beginning, we see that it's not as if Maya is married to a bad man. He's not a bad sort of fellow at all. In fact, in page 38 of this novel, in the beginning, we find Maya making this observation. People say he spoils me. This means that he fondles my cheek, holds my hand and says to me, "It's getting warm, time for us to retreat to the hills, isn't it? Where shall we go this year, Maya? Choose." People say he spoils me. They also say that I can get anything I want from him. "Darjeeling," I cry jubilantly, "of course," and jump up and down at his side. So we find Maya being treated as a child by her husband, and she also marvels at this. She's delightful about this kind of attention that she's getting from her husband in the beginning of the novel, in the earlier stages of her life. We also find that there are traces of discontentment within Maya's life, within her personality, but at the same time, in the first half of the novel, we are not really being introduced to it. There are snippets of this that Anita Desai gives us from her character. There is this particular instance, this comes in page 63, when Maya encounters this woman who has 4 daughters. We find her having these horrible thoughts about having 4 daughters. Maya thinks, "This ought not to have distressed me." She's talking about the possibility of having 4 daughters. "I ought to have been able to rejoice at this, as my father had rejoiced in me, saying that in a daughter he had a treasure. Yet now the word brought up visions of dowries, of debts, humiliations to be suffered, and burdens so gross, so painful, that the whole family suffered from them. Why, I was angry with myself, yet could not shake off the truth. And when the prim lady clucked her tongue in sympathy, I said nothing." Yeah. So this is a very telling passage. It seemed as if dowry, sati, the issues of the widow, all these were concerns which had long been buried during the nationalist phase. That post-independence period, we had begun a new journey into modernity. But here we find a novel written in the 1960s, and the nation is still young, and this young educated woman is still horrified at the possibility that raising 4 daughters also means dealing with a lot of issues related to dowry, humiliation. This certainly is not the kind of, she's certainly not thinking about the possibilities that the female gender offers, but she is thinking about the many difficulties that would be inflicted onto the family. And also about the change that comes about in Maya's character towards the end. Just like we find the character of Nora undergoing a radical change in the doll's house towards the end of the play, we find Maya also beginning to think and speak in a different way altogether. This comes on page 139, almost towards the end of the novel. "What is death then?" I asked, dropping down one earring after the other. "Two red rubies. What is death to you, Gautama? Do you believe it?" And her husband replies, "Perhaps if you clarified what you mean by death, I could tell you whether you believe in it or not. Though why should you give thought to such a subject mystifies me. It is definitely a new trend in you. You used to tell me that you were far too immersed in your garden and your cat and your friends to muse upon death." Yeah? And this is also an allusion to some of the earlier conversations that they used to have. Maya was a young woman who was interested in gardening, interested in pets, and those were the things that used to interest her, worry her. Those were her concerns. Her world was very, very limited within her own home space and her garden and the beings which surrounded her. So, her husband is certainly, Gautama, her husband is certainly alarmed when she suddenly talks about a very profound subject such as death. And he says, "Is this what you keep thinking about of these days? You are much too young." And they continue to have this conversation. "There was a time when you would have disdained so banal a consolation. That was a time when I did not need you to console you with banalities. One changes, grows." Yeah? So, Maya herself is beginning to realize that she has grown and that she has changed, and obviously this is not something that Gautama is willing to deal with. He is not yet ready to accept the grown up version of Maya, because it was so easy to manage a childlike wife who would just listen to whatever he says and who would also delight at the prospect of a holiday, the prospect of pets, cats, gardening. It was that kind of a relationship perhaps was far easier for him to manage. And as a novel progresses and when we reach almost again towards the end, we find Maya growing up enough to pity her husband. Yeah, we find that she is no longer the self who is timid, who is cowardly. She grows up enough to pity the character that her husband has turned into. She says, "Poor Gautama, poor dear Gautama, who was so intense and yet had never lived and never would." Yeah. Here we find that Maya is in control of herself, her household, and as well as her husband, and Gautama is obviously terrified, and we know the kind of end that he met with. I will not give away the novel and spoil the interest of reading that by yourself, but nevertheless it needs to be remembered that if you look at the way in which Maya's character has transformed, if you look at the many minute details that even in the presentation Ashwati shared with you, you would see that Maya is able to enable herself, but this enabling of herself, her progressive faith in her own self, is at the cost of losing herself in a certain way. As and when she gains herself, as and when she comes to terms with her own self, when she takes charge of her own life, we also see that she is beginning to be seen as someone who is descending into madness, and she totally loses control over her mind towards the end. So, what is at stake over here? Why is it that always a woman who is being enabled, she also is forced to meet with certain kinds of ends which are not entirely enabling, which are not entirely fulfilling? We do find again, if you try to compare and contrast this with the fate of Billy Bishwas, yeah, there would be certain kind of parallels, but also we would see that whether it's a primitive kind of society or a modernized urban society, the choices which are being made available to men and women are radically different. And unless the world of fiction is also able to break out of these limiting ways of conceiving individualism, limiting ways of conceiving freedom, there is very little possibility of radically changing the idea of women's writing or radically changing the ways in which women can be accommodated into this house of fiction, the certain suggestions that we. So, what here is extremely important is the idea of home and how that becomes problematized in the field of fiction, and how the problematization of home is seen as essentially a kind of thing which happens only and mostly in the fiction written by women. So, with this we wind up for today, and we will meet again in the next class.